speaker is Rapp from our forest, and Josh's maple syrup has sweetened the spring of our forest.
Introduction. So I'm a postdoc with Elizabeth. I've been here just over a year, so I was really honored to be asked to come in and talk with everyone today. And I'm going to be, so our lab is kind of all over the place, and so I'm going to be talking about the plant side of things, and particularly trees. And these sugar maples are the ones where those bees were collected that the pollen came from. So I'm going to talk a little bit about reproductive ecology of trees, and particularly how trees make seeds. And because, as David mentioned earlier, so much of the hard forest LTR has definitely a strength in carbon cycling. I'm going to try to connect my stuff on reproductive ecology to carbon dynamics. So I'll have a little introductory material. I'll talk about the phenomenon of masting, and in particular the resource budget model. I'll talk about sugar maple as a study system and whether the sap sugar concentration is related to seed production. Talk a little bit about life history trade-offs, and this is where we get into the effects of seed production on carbon dynamics, and talk a little bit about some related studies that we're starting here at Harvard Forest. This figure is a very simple tree life cycle. It ends up in most of my talks, regardless of whether I'm talking about trees or seedlings or seeds, just because I think it's important to have a context for what we're talking about. In ecosystem studies, and talking about carbon dynamics, usually focus on trees, and particularly their growth and survival. The growth of tree boles store a lot of carbon, and it's relatively long-lasting pool of carbon, at least in comparison to leaves and fine roots and things. And when a large tree dies, that's one way that carbon can leave a system. But I'd like to point out that carbon storage is not really the purpose of a tree. The tree has a purpose. The purpose of a tree, like all organisms, is to pass on its genes, to make sure its DNA moves into the next generation. And most trees do that by making seeds. So that in itself should make seed production kind of interest, and particularly when we're thinking about a time when we have climate change and insect pest outbreaks and other landscape changes. The ability of forests to remain on the landscape and respond to changes and shifts in species composition and species distributions, trees need to be able to reproduce from seed. Which brings me to masting. So masting is the episodic and synchronous production of seeds across the population. Oaks are kind of the most famous masting species because when you go out in the fall during a mast year and there's acorns all over the ground, they're very noticeable. But a lot of other species are also masting. This data here is from the White Mountains in a sugar maple stand. And it shows seed production over about 11 years. And you can see that there are essentially two seed levels, none or a lot. That's fairly typical for masting species, where you have very different seed production from year to year. So why do trees do this? Why don't they just make the same number of seeds each year? One possibility is that they're just tracking climate. Climate changes from year to year, so they might just be producing lots of seeds when climate's variable and fewer when it's not so much. But the bimodal pattern we see in many species suggests that there's some sort of endogenous process going on, at least in part. And so there's been a lot of ideas about why masting would be an important evolved strategy for species to increase their fitness. And most of these have something to do with density-dependent benefits of concentrating seed production in certain years. And those have to do with escaping seed predators. If a tree produces lots of seeds and maybe more than the populations of seed predators can eat, and therefore some of them will escape and turn into seedlings. If you go outside the hall here and poke around in the grass, you'll see a whole bunch of seedlings coming up. And those are from the sugar maples that masted last year. Some species, it may be important to produce lots of seeds to attract seed dispersers. That's true for another species that I studied, the white bark pine out in the western US and Canada. And then also pollination efficiency may increase in years when there are more individuals flowering. Whatever kind of the evolutionary driver of masting is, there needs to be a proximate mechanism. And so the main ones that they come up with are here. Climate cues may be important for some species. This is especially true of the mixed species forests of Southeast Asia, where many different species will flower at the same time during the El Nino years. In the temperate zone, where seasonal variability in climate is much greater than interannual variability, even in a year like this one, we've had an unusually warm winter. Winter is still much colder than summer. Climate cues seem less likely to be the whole story. So the other ideas are the resource budget model and pollen coupling, and I'll spend the next few slides talking about the resource budget model, and I'll come back to the pollen coupling a little bit later. This is a picture I took last spring during the height of sugar maple flowering. One thing you'll notice here is that the canopies are covered with flowers, but the leaves are just starting to emerge. And this is a common thing for forest trees to do. They put out their flowers before the leaves. This makes wind pollination more efficient when you don't have leaves in the way. Insect pollinators can also see the flowers much better. So it makes sense if you're a tree to put your flowers out first. But that has some cost. When you flower before the leaves are out, that requires stored resources rather than using photosynthate that's coming directly from the leaves. And the stored resources that we typically talk about in plants are non-structural carbohydrates, which are stored in the sapwood. I like to think of the resource budget model as one of these fundraising models. You have some organization that has some needs. Say a soccer team that wants to get new jerseys, right? They need to get a certain amount of money, get up to the top here before they can spend that money and buy whatever it is they want. So they put one of these things. I got this off the web. You can get these widgets for just about anything. Trees aren't sending out fundraising letters, but they are photosynthesizing, and then their currency is sugar. That's the main product of photosynthesis. So as the sun beats down, the tree is out there photosynthesizing. It's filling up with resources, and then when it gets enough resources, it can produce flowers and seeds. That in essence is the research budget model. It's been formalized first by Isagi and colleagues in 1998, and it's since been expanded, and there's been lots of theoretical studies that have explored different aspects of this model. There's been relatively less empirical data to show that this actually works. So that's one of the things we are looking at with sugar maples. And why study sugar maples? Well, luckily for us, there's this long history of collecting carbohydrate samples from sugar maples. I think we can find some data. So we first need to know whether the sap sugar content actually reflects the resource status of the tree. And there's some reason to think that it does. In this figure, we see that this shows the sucrose content is this top line. We see that it increases in twigs, in canopy twigs, during the time of the year when the sap is flowing and sugar producers are out there collecting sap. And that is likely the source of the sugar in the sap that is collected. It's xylem sap that is collected for maple syrup production. And the sap runs when the sugars are mobilized in the twigs. So we know that the sap sugar is a stored resource, and it's coming from a place, the twigs, which will later in the spring have buds on them that produce flowers. So there's good reason to think there's a mechanistic relationship here. So this spring, one of the things we were doing out here along the road between Shaler Hall and Fisher House is tapping maple trees and collecting every day that there was a flow. We would go out there and measure the weight of the sap and the sugar content. This is what our data looked like. I won't go through this in any great detail other than to say that flow depends a lot on the climate conditions of a given day. When you have maximum temperatures above 4 degrees C, you get decent flow. If it's below that, doesn't flow much. And once you've had warm temperatures for several days, the flow essentially stops. The other thing, the second panel shows sap sugar concentration, and we see that it fluctuates over the course of the season. So it's important to actually measure it over the course of the season, because if you were just to take a time slice here or here, you would get very different answers for your sap sugar content. And if we're going to look at the relationship between sugar concentration and seed production over many years, we need to have a good estimate of how sap sugar content changes from year to year. These bottom two panels just show the total amount of sugar, either per sap or total that we collected this year. So with this data, we can make a couple of predictions. One is that all things being equal, larger trees should have more resources. They have a larger canopy, and so they should be able to photosynthesize and collect more resources. And we do see a weak negative correlation between diameter and sugar content in the sap. But what we really want to know is whether the sugar content is correlated with seed production. We were heartened last spring to see this newsletter by the Vermont Department of Forest that noted on the same page that it was both a very heavy flowering that spring and the highest syrup production on record last year. And so this is very anecdotal and only one data point, but luckily we were able to go and find more data. This is also from Vermont. We were able to find about a decade's worth of data on seed production from the North American Maple Project and syrup yield for those same years from USDA agricultural statistics. And in the past dozen years, there have been 3 years that have been mast years for sugar maple, including last year. The first 2 years, the year following masting, get very low syrup yields, whereas non-mast years were followed by generally higher syrup yields, but also much more variable yields. And in June, when this year's statistics on the maple sugaring season come out, we'll find out if this red point is actually true. We know that that's how many trees there were with seeds last year, but we don't yet know if we're correct about this being a low syrup production year. But this suggests that there may be a correlation between syrup production and seed production. In addition to collecting sap in our trees out here, we're also monitoring flower and fruit production. We do that both with litter fall traps like this one, and then we also go out in Bucky, the Arden Forest bucket lift, and make observations of flowers and seeds on the trees themselves. So I can show you a little bit more data from this first year, preliminary data. We expect that trees that generally have more resources should invest more in seed production, One way to look at this is the amount of flowers that are produced. Sugar maples have functionally separate male and female flowers. So you would expect that trees that have fewer resources would invest relatively more in male flowers because pollen is cheaper to produce than maturing seeds, since the seeds are much larger. And this is indeed what we see. So we have negative correlation between sugar in the sap, or our proxy for resource status of the tree, and the proportion of male flowers. So these trees down here are more female, they're producing more seeds. I can show you that even better in the next figure. You get more seeds in trees that had a higher cherry content of sap. So I would promise I would link my work on seed production to carbon dynamics. One way this can work is through trade-offs in carbon allocation. So we're going back to the tree life cycle. There's several different functions that trees need to do. And so you could have trade-offs between maintenance, reproduction, and growth. In particular, if a tree is putting more resources into seeds, it may be putting less of those resources into wood, which would be the longer lasting carbon pool. Eventually we may be able to look at this, but we'll need several years of seed data before we can do that. So I will talk a little bit about a perhaps less recognized trade-off, and that's between carbon acquisition and reproduction. This is a study of a tropical cloud forest species that has separate male and female trees. The female trees, when they produce more fruits, have lower photosynthetic capacity of the leaves. So individual leaves have lower photosynthetic capacity when that plant is producing fruits. And this is hypothesized to be because nutrients, and particularly nitrogen, that are being provisioned to the fruits are then not available for the maintenance of the photosynthetic apparatus. A little bit closer to home, this is from a study in Michigan at 5 sugar maple stands across Michigan. It showed that there was a negative correlation between the change in reproductive litter, i.e. seeds and flowers, versus foliar litter, leaves. So it appears that when sugar maples are producing more seeds at the stand level, they're producing fewer leaves. And we see that in our own data at a much smaller scale than of individual shoots. In shoots that have flowers produce fewer leaves than shoots that do not have flowers, and the length of those shoots is greater for shoots that don't have flowers than the ones that do. So we could have both a carbon acquisition trade-off here, where there's fewer leaves that are photosynthesizing when there are seeds produced, and possibly also an allocation trade-off, where the photosynthate that is being brought in by the leaves is going more towards maturing the fruits here than towards growing shoots. I'll finish up with some of the ongoing and planned studies we have. We've been working on the sugar maple project for less than a year, so we will continue working on the resource dynamics of masting and also the pollination ecology, which Elizabeth alluded to in her last talk. For the resource dynamics, we'll be continuing what will become long-term monitoring of flowers, seeds, and sap. And we're also interested in where the resources that provision maturing seeds come from. So we can do some twig defoliation and girdling experiments to get at that. We're also looking for regional data on syrup yields and seed production, which we will continue to look both from USDA agricultural statistics and with partnerships with local syrup producers. And we're looking for seed production data from litter fall and monitoring studies. Harbor Brook comes to mind as a possibility there. In terms of pollination ecology with sugar maples, even though we have good evidence that bees visit flowers, you don't actually know whether sugar maples are predominantly pollinated by bees or by wind. And so we'll be doing some studies with pollinator exclusion experiments to get at that. And we're also looking at population dynamics of intervening bees. Why that's important is because one thing I mentioned earlier is that pollen coupling is one of the mechanisms for synchronizing individuals across the population of masting trees. Oops, sorry. If seed production is limited by pollination, and seed maturation depletes resources more than flowering, this can set up a situation where if an individual flowers in a year when others in the population are not flowering, it will not set seed, it will not be pollinated, it will not set seed, and it will not reduce its resources very much so in the following year it can flower again when other individuals in the population are also flowering. In that year, there will be good pollination, seeds will be set, resources reduced, and individuals will become synchronized across the population. This is an earlier study by Elizabeth that showed in a bee-pollinated wildflower that there was indeed pollen limitation. These top, the filled circles are individuals that were given supplemental pollen, and during a year when there was in general a low flowering density of plants, those with supplemental pollen had more fruits than those that did not. And that advantage disappeared in a year when there was a high flowering density of plants, so that there was plenty of pollen to go around. There have also been several theoretical studies that have shown that once thresholds of pollen limitation and resource depletion are met, that there can be synchronous seed production, flowering and seed production across populations. This is data from the same bees that Elizabeth showed the pollen from earlier. It was collected by James Krall, a graduate student in OEB at Harvard. And like Elizabeth said earlier, we see that there are the bees in the canopy are doing different things than the bees on the ground. They're actually different species, and the diversity is much different as well between the canopy and the ground. One final thing we're doing, because maples here are very convenient to study because they're right along the road, but they don't actually make up a large portion of the forest canopy. This is a graph that David showed in his introductory talk, and it shows that oaks really are driving, in this case, the woody biomass patterns of the plot over time. And so oaks are an important player in the forest here, and so we're interested in expanding our studies to oaks. One thing we can look at is whether there's this carbon acquisition trade-off between reproduction and getting carbon. And we see that this is just showing some very preliminary data from the MS litter fall plots, showing that there seems to be a negative correlation between acorn mass and leaf litter in these plots. So it kind of follows what I showed you earlier with the maples. And finally, we're also looking at the consumers of acorns. Rafael Zolak, a former PhD student of Elizabeth and now a professor in Poland, is heading up a study to look at chipmunk population dynamics along with the oak nest. With that, thank you for listening, and thank the people and facilities here at Harvard for making this research possible, particularly Bucky for getting me up in the canopy, and the Shaler Hall kitchen for letting me boil down all the sap that we put.
So
the flowers of maples, they're green, so presumably are photosynthesizing to some extent. Do you have any handle on, to what extent they are self-sufficient, or, either how much do they have to fundraise outside of their own?
Yes, that's something we don't know for maples. That's one of the things that the defoliation drilling experiments can get at, because you can look at whether how much of the carbon is actually fixed by the structure itself. But that's something we need to know.
Yeah, I mean, it's the seeds.
And the seeds are green as well, so
Yeah.
they're probably photosynthesizing to a degree.
I know that in pine you have maybe less seed production with lower light levels deeper in the canopy. Are the trees, the acorns, and the maples you're talking about, do they have that same pattern, or is the carbon stocks more better mixed?
So we sampled flowers and seeds from various canopy levels last year, and in general there's more flowers, a given bud will have more flowers in the canopy than lower down. Last year there was flowers throughout the canopy. And my guess is that there was a slightly better maturation rate in the upper part of the canopy than lower down, but the flowers at least are throughout the canopy.
What about acorns?
We haven't really started looking at that yet, so
I looked at red oak acorns at the Quabbin on the Prescott many years ago, and they seem to be pretty well distributed throughout at least the upper canopy. What was really interesting with the acorns was that there were trees that we called super females that just really cranked out acorns and seemed to do it year after year after year. And there were other trees right by them that produced very little.
So for the sugar maples, what you really would like is concentration data rather than production data. And so, two questions. One, I guess I would have thought that someplace like the Maple Syrup Lab at UVM would actually collect concentration data. That's one, and it may well be, amateurs elsewhere who do that frequently enough and for a long enough period you can actually look at. And then secondly, whether you could correct your data by looking at the duration of the season. Because production is so dependent on weather that you can, some of that scatter that you've got is the difference in the duration of the season.
Right, yeah. So
And you could go back and look at climate records and actually personal records, because there are people who keep very close tabs on what days they're collecting soil.
Right, yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think I can go in that direction and get that detailed data.
I just to comment on that. I was just, when you showed your chart of sugar concentration for this year, I did a quick check of the weather data from this year for the forest, and that date with peak flow or peak concentration was the date with the most active PAR, the highest PAR. And it seemed to follow the shape of that curve that you've got.
Right,
just with a quick eyeball.
Yeah, and that's partly the temperature. Yeah, so that's, I'm sure I'm over time by now.